Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today, Charlene Lee. And apologies for the late start, technical difficulties on the back end. So I think you all have shared in some of those activities. The joy and wonders of live streaming. Bless it. So today we're going to be talking about sustainability and in particular the transformation efforts that people go through. So I have been focused on disruptive trends, especially around the digital space for the past 20 years. And what strikes me is that the sustainability efforts that companies are going through, in particular about transforming their organizations to be much more sustainable, is also just as transformative, if not more so than the digital transformations that organizations have been going through. And it's been interesting going to sustainability conferences, talking with sustainability officers. These are new roles that are coming up. The challenges and the conversations they have so much remind me of the digital transformations that organizations have been going through. And what I wanted to talk about today was how to think about sustainability and digital in the same space and how the two are actually really, really related to each other. And yet, in most organizations, they are very separate parts of transformation. There are different initiatives, they sit in different areas. And in many ways, when you're trying to drive sustainability inside an organization, the digital part of the organization can become a huge help, but also in some ways is a big, huge area for transformation itself. So I want to go through today and talk about what it means to be a transformative organization. So welcome. And what I want to talk about today is how have you, I would love you for you to share, how have you been driving sustainability, either in the workplace or in your personal lives? And I really relate to Jay's point that has installed solar panels at home and at work, got a hybrid Jeep. Jay, fantastic examples of that. Fully support that, and especially doing it in the workplace and not just having it at home. We also have so keep asking, putting in how you're thinking about sustainability, and then also ask questions. So, for example, Jay has asked about sustainable digital transformations. So I'm going to be definitely talking about that. So, first of all, what I'd like to do is to talk about what does it mean to be sustainable, because I think there's a definition here about what is sustainability. Oftentimes, we think about it as related to the environment, to climate, and it's that, but it's also about how do we also sustain ongoing businesses, and so the profits, being able to help organizations prosper to promote growth in our economies. But it's also around the social aspects. How do we have greater equity, access to opportunities? The idea of having no more poverty, for example, these are very much related to the 17 United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, the SDGs, as they're called. And it's really important to think much more holistically about sustainability. And the idea here is that if you are creating a sustainable business that is not using the resources, that you can recycle resources, regenerate resources rather than being extractive of them, then it also leads to also sustainable societies and people, that we are investing for the long term, not exploiting and trying to take things away, and that it's going to be sustainable for the generations that come after us. Understandably, young people today are up in arms because we are not thinking and operating and living in a sustainable way and leaving the world in a place where they can also thrive. So I think in many ways, this idea of the economy, of society, and of the environment translated into the pithy phrase of profit, people, and planet, the three pillars of sustainability. So when I talk about sustainability, it is much more of this holistic approach, not just the environment and the climate. I want to make sure we're on that same plane there. So I'm just looking here at some of the comments. Okay, so we have Sanjay who is saying, I'm sorry, here we go, that this is an interesting subject, that digitalization and digital both are now time to complement sustainability. And we'll talk a little bit about how digital in particular can help. It is actually not just helping, but a foundation for sustainable practices. Okay, so So we're talking about sustainable transformation. And Jay talks about how culture is a bridge. We'll definitely talk about culture. And that greenwashing is definitely an issue when it comes to this. Greenwashing being, again, not just about the environment, but people putting out token actions, but not really following up. And we'll talk about some of the examples around why this is so important and why it is an indication of why sustainability and the transformation around this is so difficult. So let's dive into this. Uh, First of all, what's the big difference between sustainability transformations and digital transformations? And the big issue here, from my perspective, is that we can see digital transformations happening in small areas of the organization where you can have a tremendous impact, for example, by digitizing analog processes within one department. So you can take recruitment, for example, and digitize that and have a huge transformation, a lot of gains around it. You can digitize, for example, finance or sales, even product design. So there's areas that you can get immediate impact from digital transformations because you're really looking at the core processes of an organization. You can tackle that right from the very beginning. Sustainability has a very different issue in that if you start pulling and putting in place some sustainable practices in one area, for example, in supply chain, it quickly escalates and has downstream or upstream impacts into the rest of the organization. So sustainability by its very nature is impacting multiple parts of the organization very early on. So if you want to see any real gains, you have to coordinate across an entire part of the organization. And with digital transformation, you have this little bit of time, quite a bit of time in this maturity cycle to be able to create a foundation, get some gains, prove that it's actually working before really tackling bigger issues. The sustainability, you're once you start pulling one little thread of sustainability, it quickly unravels into the rest of the organization. So the reality is that we also see a significant gap, and this is a key reason why transformation is needed when it comes to sustainability. Some of the stats say that 84% of companies have defined sustainability targets, but only 28% are on track to achieve those goals by the time they've set. And some other studies have said that only 30% of companies who have concerted sustainability efforts believe that they're actually being successful. So there is this big gap between the ambition of where we want to be and the actual actions that people are taking, and also the results that we're seeing. And a lot of this comes from a lot of different reasons. Just a couple other things. The World Economic Forum did a survey of business makers, and the vast majority of them have identified climate-related risks to be the top biggest issues, the top 3 biggest issues facing businesses today. And also there's a strong belief now that the economics of sustainability, especially around the environment, are to the point where technology has made these green strategies not just profitable, but also the source of some competitive advantage in the marketplace. So let me give you an example of how difficult this is. Dell came out with a beautiful concept called Concept Luna at the end of last year. So the idea is that most laptops are actually glued together, which means that if one component breaks, you have to toss the entire thing and get a new one. This is done for durability, for lowering the costs, but it also makes it very difficult to repair them. And so there's been a long demand to say, hey, can we just take apart the various components? I can upgrade the CPU. I can upgrade the memory. I can change out the battery when it's starting to wear out. And ways to make our electronics, laptops, mobile phones, for example, much more durable and renewable. And so the idea that Dell came up with this beautiful laptop, a proof of concept called Concept Luna, that had no glue, there were much fewer screws, and the idea is that you could replace components. Now, Dell has said that they wanted to do this for a while, but in order for them to make this, to take this from just a concept into something that's actually real, requires that they rethink their supply chain, the way they go to market, the service that goes with it, the way they sell it, the way they do financing, the way they design, everything has to be rethought to bring this one product to market. We all agree that it's the right thing to do, and we want it now. But the reality is a huge transformation has to happen within Dell in order to make Concept Luna more than just a concept and a real product. So that's just a quick example that I think we all see the potential, but it requires a huge amount of transformation behind it as well. So let me give you just one other example of how various organizations are starting to rethink this, and that's around fashion. Urban Outfitters, which is a parent company for brands like Urban Outfitters and Anthropologie, launched a new service called Nuuly, Nuuly, for rental. So they would take their clothing and create a rental marketplace. And it was an answer to this whole idea of fast fashion. And at the end of last year, they also launched a new service called Nuuly Thrift. So the idea is that they would take the end of life inventory from the rental department or some areas around their, again, excess inventory from their stores, from fashion retail, and put it into thrift, but also allow people to sell their own products. And this is a deep understanding of their own audience. I'm actually in that audience. I am a very loyal subscriber to Nuuly Rent. So I don't buy clothes. I try not to buy new clothes. I either rent or buy thrift. And what they found is of their existing customers at Urban Outfitters, 3/4 of them had made a secondhand purchase in the past year, and half of them had sold their clothes in some sort of marketplace. So it made a lot of sense to have this branded marketplace to service existing customers. And they were looking at this as a way to transform the business to create new revenue streams. So I think this is, again, another example of how companies are seeing this as an opportunity for growth, no longer something that's a cost that they have to sustain. So I'm going to go next into how to approach this marketplace, but I see a lot of comments here. So I want to go through and just tackle some of them. Let's see. We have M. Morgan, and I know who this is. So can you talk about sustainability? How can it relate both to the environmental impacts of a company compared to sustainability of a company to survive as they shift to greener practices? So I will definitely talk about that in some of the maturity models and processes. The key area here is that when we talk about sustainability, there's always been a belief that you have to trade off sustainability for profits. And again, as I showed with Nuuly and potentially with Dell, there's a belief that you can actually make more money because of the ability to do this. Now, one of the key challenges, and I'll talk about just how you go about doing this, is understanding where value is created. And so let me give you an example of cars and automobile industries. For the longest time, it was about how do we make hybrid cars? How do we make electronic vehicle cars? They're seen as more expensive. They're difficult to make. Is the market really there? And there was a shift thanks to Tesla that people want this. And especially with sky-high gas prices right now, there's even more demand. So you have companies like General Motors saying by the year 2050, we're not going to make combustion engines anymore. And that was ahead of California saying we're not going to allow combustion engine cars to be sold by 2050. So this is an interesting opportunity for General Motors to say, we see the market demand, we're going to run towards it, and we're going to define ourselves as no longer a combustion car company, but thinking about us not even as an EV company, electronic vehicle company, but in the space of green and clean mobility, getting you from one place to the other. So that means they're getting into new businesses like charging stations, thinking about mobility in terms of public transportation and how to support that. So the definition of what business General Motors is in is completely being defined. And even Tesla, where they said they were in the car business, it looked like, but they're actually in the energy business because their core competence is making these amazing batteries. And so those batteries can actually go into homes. And guess what? Your car can actually, your EV vehicle can actually be a battery that when you plug into the house becomes this place where your solar can charge the car, that can then charge the house because it's the same battery. So it's interesting how we can think about the actual car in a very different way because of these sustainability models. So a couple other comments we have here. Let's see, lots of great comments today. I think we're touching a chord here. Sanjay says, now sustainability without integrating digital transformation is not possible. Digitizing and mining industries started and someday will prove sustainability mining process without digital would not be possible. Absolutely. So Sanjay, you raise a really good point that the sustainability practices and the opportunities we're seeing today could not have been possible if we did not have this digital transformation. The ability to tie and see things across the organization, imagine if we hadn't done that, we didn't have the data available, the IoT sensors, the digital twin models that we can build now that allow us to look at these different business models of sustainability. So great point there. Lynn has a comment here that more collaboration within industries will improve sustainability along with customer experience. Lynn, I can always count on you to talk about the customer experience. Fantastic. For example, the lack of universality among power chargers creates redundancy and waste between and within households. That's a great example because if I use MacBooks, but my family members and friends will bring in Windows machines, the connections are completely different. If we could go to universal USB-C ports, for example, for power, that's beginning to create it a lot easier across the power and charging. So I can take my Mac charger, plug it in, and put it into a Windows machine that also uses USB-C, etc. So great point around that. Malika has a point here that digital transformation includes using information to make human-centric decisions. Fantastic, and provides continuity within developments and advancements in technology. Sustainability and digital transformation should go hand in hand. Malika, I can't agree with you even more than that. We're going to be talking in 2 weeks about how to unite these two things, not just digital and sustainable, but also culture transformations, which is what I'll talk about next week. But also, how do you think about transformations across the organization? How do we rationalize these areas? And comment here and question from Leonardo, why do some organizations and leaders dealing with digital transformation ESG as only a marketing strategy? Do they understand the importance of it for the future? I completely agree with you, Leonardo. In some ways, it feels like, again, to Jay's point earlier, that people are greenwashing. They're putting out grand and beautiful statements and visions, but where's the action following up? Again, as I stated with some of the data there, that only about less than a third of people who have sustainability efforts feel like they're doing a good job of it. They would even admit that they're not there. So we're going to talk about that in just a second. And Cindy also, hi Cindy, has a question here. What can be done to up to date the changes in the car industry? Climate changes are now, and car companies think we have this long time to make changes. So, okay, I see what your point. How can we speed up the changes in the industries? It's interesting, Cindy. One of the key issues around electronic vehicles is not just the demand, but also the infrastructure to be able to make enough to have charging stations, to have the electricity plants that generate that. And the electricity plants themselves are not clean. They're burning coal. So there's this interesting balance around this. And but the fact that Tesla and General Motors are again consistently selling out of their EV cars is really increasing that demand and also the production. I do believe that this goal of creating no more combustion engines is going to take some time because there's still a need for that, because there are places in the country where there are no EV vehicles, EV charging stations. So there's this gradual coming in and the replacement of these things. Can it go faster? Absolutely. I do think some of the changes that are coming in through the infrastructure bill and also the latest bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's actually a climate act, will actually help accelerate a lot of that. And so while there's a goal of no more selling the combustion engines cars by a certain date, I think it's actually going to shift a lot faster because of consumer demand. All right, let's go through and talk a little bit about some of the ways to actually do this. So one of the things that is so important is creating a strategy that's aligned with purpose. And one of the things I wanted to show is just some great ways to think about this. So one of the ideas behind a strategy is to understand what really makes a difference. And I want to give you two examples from two companies that I've seen recently. I'm going to make this as big as I can so that I can read it even. This is a materiality map from Ricoh. Again, they make a lot of electronics and printers and other technologies. And they've identified 7 material issues that really impact their sustainability efforts, but also their business. 2 areas separated into them, and then 17 ESG targets. And they go through and have very specific plans and metrics to tie those activities back into the business and the business back into these activities to demonstrate, again, what are the things that are really important to the organization in terms of identifying, resolving the social issues through the businesses that they have. Things, for example, the quality of life enhancement, zero carbon in society, creativity from work, and then also the internal aspects of managing and running a more sustainable business. Everything from stakeholder engagement and open innovation. I love the fact that diversity and inclusion are included in their materiality map. And so that's one example. And here's another one from Danone, which is the food products company. They make Danone yogurt, for example. And they've identified 4 categories of materiality. So everything from the planet to the supply chain, and identifying scope 3 emissions that the supply chain may be having. Again, scope 1 is what you are actually creating. Scope 2 is what everybody in your organization is creating. For example, scope 1 would be from the actual production of yogurt. Scope 2 would be all the things driving to the office from your employees, people flying around. Scope 2 are the ancillary things created by your organization, not directly related to product. And scope 3 is all the supply chain. And for example, if you're buying milk, what is the emission impact of that milk production coming in? So as you can imagine, scope 1, pretty identifiable. Scope 2, pretty much under control. Scope 3, really difficult. But what Danone is doing is saying we want to identify those 2 as well. Planet impacts, and of course, health and nutrition, the engagement and looking at society, the impact on people. So what they've done here are tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 areas of materiality and prioritize this thing. And this is in 2021 when they did this, and it's an update from the one that they had done the year before. So they continue to update and map out the different ways that they are seeing the business having an impact on various areas of sustainability. And so that kind of deep analysis of looking at the business, I think, is a core foundational thing to do, because it's tying the things that you actually do to the important aspects, what's going to really make a difference. Because you could do anything and everything in the world. You can do anything, but you can't do everything. So where are the areas that you are going to choose and to prioritize? So I think that's a really important thing to do. The other thing is when you're creating that strategy is to look at aligning that against your purpose, understanding how it's going to impact your business model and operating model potentially. The second thing to do after you've looked at your strategy and seen where the biggest levers are, it's to go and understand where business value is actually created. So this goes back to the question that M. Morgan had. Where is value being created? Is it actually in the change in operations? And then how is that going to be messaged out to your organization, to your employees, to the marketplace, to your investors? And is that going to increase the value of your brand? Is it going to give you higher sales, higher pricing points, greater market share? Is it going to give you access to capital because investors are now looking for green practices? And then after you've understood and where you can capture new value, then it's thinking about where are you going to build the capability in the core of the business to actually make it sustainable in these practices to support, again, those material areas and to also capture that value. And what we think about as nice to have things that you would do when you're flush with money, and it's becoming more and more difficult to do today in this environment that we have with the economy, is to think about this. And you may have to take short-term hits, but does that give you long-term capabilities to be able to take advantage of this new business value? And also, very importantly, in the future, what may seem like a nice to have may actually be table stakes. So, understanding how the economy is changing, but also how consumer and investor and employee expectations are also changing, and to be ahead of that. And then the fourth thing is to create new business models, new sustainable businesses. I'll give you an example. We know that recyclable plastics are going to be in huge demand because more and more companies want to use recycled plastics in their products for packaging or actually making the products. And yet, the estimates that there is going to be 45% unmet demand just by 2025. So we're kind of balanced right now, really running into supply issues with recycled plastics. By 2025, 45% of demand will be unmet. That is a huge business opportunity for somebody who wants to get into this space and develop. And the economics now actually support developing some of these new plastics, taking things that couldn't be recycled in the past and finding ways to actually recycle them. So again, just to reiterate, the first one is to align your strategy against your purpose, to look for these materiality areas, to define what's most important and set a strategy, what you will do and won't do around sustainability. The second is to capture that business value, understand what value is created in your operations, build capability in the core, develop new sustainable businesses. And the last part, a very important part, is the storytelling. The storytelling around why you are doing this, what you are doing, what are the challenges, and to set expectations across all the different stakeholders. The problem is that oftentimes we're telling the story ahead of the game before we've had a chance to work out those details. Or we try to tell the story, but we know there are missing components to it. We're not necessarily forthcoming about explaining this is why it's going to take a while. This is why it's so hard. And to set those expectations of when we can promise things. In many ways, we're still telling the story in the old way. We're telling just the good news. I'm talking about our accomplishments. We're not talking about the reality is we want to go in this direction, and it's going to be really hard for us to get there. And this is why we need to have you being brought along. This is why investors, what you can expect, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what it's going to look like. So I wanted to just explain a little bit of that process, but I also want to lay out for you just to give you an idea of what this maturity model looks like. I love maturity models because you feel a little bit better that, okay, this is where I am and this is where I need to be. And especially with transformations, how far along on this journey am I? Am I where I want to be? And what do I have to do to get to the next stage? So I have 5 different stages of a maturity model to understand where you are in a sustainable transformation. The one is in the very beginning, you're doing one-off projects. You're saying, okay, let's try this. Let's do a little bit of recycling here. Let's support a good cause. It's not really connected to the core of the business. So these are sort of one-off projects and funding against green and sustainable practices. DEI sometimes comes across that way, supporting, again, various green initiatives. You may make a donation. So it's good. All of it would take it, but it's very much one-off. It's not sustainable, and it's not integrated into any of the core business practices. I think most companies have experimented in that or have moved on to the second area, which is we're looking at some organizational practices. Now, we have some people who may be leading sustainability. They may be looking at ways to reduce our footprint, moving from paper to electronics, have recycling. We may be even looking at supply chain to look for and source more sustainable ways to feed into the operations of the business. But again, it's still on the fringes. We're not changing things fundamentally. We're sort of replacing things. And it's equivalent to when you're doing a digital transformation, taking analog processes and making them digital without really changing the core of the business. The third area is when it starts getting interesting. It's unlocking new business opportunities. So over in this corner, we see some experimentation happening. We're going to try doing some new experiments around sustainable practices. So it's starting to go into the core, but the reality is most of the business is still stuck in business as usual. Nothing's really clearly changed. We have some experiments over there. They're given some life to breathe over there. There's a bit of funding around that experiment. And then we'll see what we can bring in. It fundamentally starts changing, though, in the fourth stage, where there is this culture of sustainability. We're actually starting to change things. And this is really hard, which is why culture of sustainability is so important. You need that culture to actually sustain you, to help you through this really tough period, because it's going to require us to reconfigure everything that we do. We have to be able to work across organizational silos. And again, those materiality ideas, the areas of issues, become this guiding light to be able to say, this is really important to us as a business. Now we can reach across those silos and be able to come together because we have the strong sense of purpose, strong sense of this is a material issue. We're aligned against that strategy, and we're actually going to make this work. And the culture becomes so important because as you're doing this hard work and making progress, it comes back to people inside the organization to say, wow, this is great. We're actually making progress. And it becomes this wonderful upward spiral of support to do even more hard work. And then what happens in stage 5 is when you've actually transcended this and become a purpose-driven organization around sustainability. So this is, again, moving beyond just having an organization that's focused on profit, but also very much focused on people and planet. So this is, for example, automobile makers moving beyond just making electronic vehicles and saying, how do we build a sustainable mobile society? It's healthcare moving from just addressing curative and therapies to really investing in preventative care and making that the core of the business rather than the tangential part. And it's really shifting to say, as a purpose of our organization, it's no longer just to make a profit. How do we actually contribute to the overall well-being of people, of our societies, our communities, of our planet and the environment? So larger issues there about how to actually do that. It's the core of the research I'm doing right now at PA Consulting, really looking at how do you actually put these strategies together, because it's really hard and there's no clear path of how to do this. All right, I'm going to check and see if there's other comments here. So many more comments. All right, let's see. We have, in terms of the culture, Jay saying that trust is integral. Today's institutions, both public and private, are extremely low marks. Agreed with that. Just look at any of the trust barometers from Edelman. You can see this. And sustainability depends on the ability to attract and retain people. What's interesting, Jay, is, again, that when you look at trust across organizations, the institutions of government, for example, are not trusted at all. And people actually trust CEOs and institutions quite a bit more. But still, that trust level is not as high as it could be. Let's see. Sanjay has PDCA as a tool for plan, do, check, and act is a great way to ensure sustainability is using digital technology. So thank you for that acronym. I love that. Plan, do, check if it's happening, and then act again. Let's see. Hiba has a point here. I believe the main challenge is how to make these ideas come alive inside the organization. How can we have that change happening, or is there any special ways of presenting it? We'll talk a little bit about this next week when we talk about the culture and how do we change the culture of having things come alive. So Hiba, I hate to say it, but let's join next week, because this is, again, not just about communicating it, but changing the fundamental ways that organizations believe and the way that we behave around that culture. Let's see, any other comments here? We have Marissa again. We often tout the need for sending less to landfills, and yet a lot of trash is coming from overall packaging, some of which is used as loss prevention. So that's a great point, Marissa. Packaging is a huge issue. One of the things I found very interesting is that the X Prize, they give $1 million grants to people who come up with great ideas, has one now around sustainable packaging, and especially around plastic wrap, for example. It's one thing to talk about recyclable bottles and packaging and moving away from plastics and into cardboard, for example, or paper. Plastic wrap is one of those things that is really, really hard to get rid of. And it's really efficient at keeping things together and in place. So how do we get rid of that, and how do we address it? So this is a really key point too as well. So thank you for sharing that. Marissa has also a point here about EV stations, that Starbucks is hoping to incorporate them into their locations. I hadn't heard about that, but that's such a great idea. Also wondered about installing stations at locations such as grocery stores, movie theaters, where people normally would be spending longer periods of time. And we're beginning to see more of that happening. For example, oftentimes I'll see one next to a Best Buy or Target in shopping centers. I own a Tesla, so I'm constantly being aware of where these charging stations are, whether they're Tesla or not. And increasingly, there are places I know I can plan my shopping trips or my movie trips. Here in San Francisco, I go and charge my car at places when I go see movies, for example. So these are all great examples of sustainability becoming an issue, not just for the car makers, but for anybody where parking and people are spending time is taking place. So great examples. And also Marissa has a point not to mention the use of rooftops of these large commercial buildings as solar farms. One of my favorite examples of this is when people put solar panels over parking lots, especially here in California, where it's really hot in the Central Valley. It creates shade. It creates that solar power. It's using up space that would otherwise just be parking spaces and creating these big black holes of heat. So it's like a win-win-win when I go to the IKEA in Sacramento and I can park underneath a solar panel, keep my car cool, know I can charge my car, and just fantastic synergies there that's happening. So there's a lot going on here in terms of the areas that we can talk about. But I want to just end at this point and thank you for the time. Again, it's great to have you on these live streams, have the comments come in. Thank you so much. This is an area that I'm very passionate about, and I encourage you to think about how to think about the roles that technology has, because none of this would be really possible unless we have this. But the reality is digital transformation sits over here, sustainability transformation sits over here, and they need to be brought together. So next week on November 1st, again, at that usual time, I will try endeavor to be on time this time. And that is, we're going to be talking about culture and how to think about culture transformation, because that is a fundamental underpinning that links digital transformation and sustainability transformation. And then on November 8th, I'll be talking about how we're actually going through and taking all of these transformations and pulling together. So it's like a little mini a couple weeks here around transformations and how to think about them. Thank you again so much for joining today. I appreciate all of you for joining, and for those of you listening to this. Again, always, as I always encourage you, reach out to me on social through my various handles, and reach out and let me know if you have questions, ideas that I can bring into the streams here. Until next week, take care and all the best. Bye-bye.